I started to get a lot of very strange pushback from one of the technical VPs. The pushback didn't make sense. It was like, hey, this isn't what the CEO told me. These numbers don't make sense for my team. I'm going to lose all of my people. And what I was able to deduce after talking back to the founders and CEOs was that they were no longer aligned with the compensation philosophy that they approved just a couple months prior.
Welcome to the WorkOps Podcast. In every episode, we dig into one story, a process that went sideways, a system that just didn't work, and what someone actually did about it. It's packed with practical lessons that you'll want to bring straight back to your team. This podcast is brought to you by Kinfolk, the AI service desk built for HR. I'm your host, Jeet, and with that, let's dive in. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the WorkOps Podcast. Today, I am joined by Kelsey Browning, who's a VP of People Operations. Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we kind of dive into all the details and your story, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you ended up choosing HR?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for hosting me. So I'm actually, I think you hit it, the nail on the head. I'm actually one of the few people who chose HR. So I really wanted to work on the intersection of people, processes, and data after working in customer service, supply chain management, particularly procurement and contracts, as well as financial and FP&A type of work. And so was really looking for, what career path will let me work on this three-legged stool of people, processes, and data versus only working on one of them. And as somebody who was, starting to build my career and going through different experiences as well, I saw a lot of opportunities for efficiencies and taking more of that supply chain mindset and applying it into an HR function.
That is really cool. You have such a great kind of trifecta of the FP&A. You've got the customer service, which again relates so nicely into providing a good experience for the employees. And then, of course, the supply chain process mindset. That's awesome to hear. Thanks for sharing that. Let's dive into your story that you have for us today. No need to name any companies if you don't need to, but at least what kind of company were you working for at the
Absolutely.
time?
Yeah. So would love to, chat about because I think a lot of people leaders have either run into this problem or will run into this problem. It's a matter of time. And it's a good lesson learned. A few years ago, I was working at a Series B to Series C startup, fully remote, and was really working as what I'll call the first professional HR hire. What I mean by that was that, they had started to build out the HR team, but they didn't have anybody in-house who actually had HR experience. So, coming into that, of course, you want to balance, listening to why things are the way that they are with we've got to make a lot of changes and quickly, especially if the company is going through any sort of changes like fundraising, or even just, basic things like becoming more capital efficient, right? So this particular problem that I ran into, which was the first time that I ran into it, was I walked in and the company had actually hired some compensation consultants to build out their first ever compensation philosophy, which is great. I was like, yes, wonderful. We're going to have something and it's aligned on. I have it in writing that it's aligned on, from the founders and the CEO. And like wonderful. We just need to go through the education process, which is a big lift when we're talking about going from having no compensation philosophy to having one, because especially in this type of startup environment, really, like I'd say Series A up to Series D, you're going to have a variety of experience within your managers. So you're going to have the been there done that manager who's like, yep, I know what a compensation philosophy is, like I know how to talk about it, I'm good, to a person who you need to explain why you even need a compensation philosophy to start with, right? So you have to account for that L&D side around how do I educate individuals, how do I enable folks. So within that, started to do my enablement program, and I started with the executive team who had already known, high level, this is coming, was signed off by the founders. And I started to get a lot of very strange pushback from one of the technical VPs to the point where I was confused because the pushback didn't make sense. It was like, hey, this isn't what the CEO told me. These numbers don't make sense for my team. I'm going to lose all of my people in Canada, which was a heating up market at the time, but was still nowhere near as competitive as New York or San Francisco. And in he was very, very concerned that the compensation philosophy didn't account for his group. Now, stereotypically, the group that he ran, I won't call them out, by name, but that particular function tends to, you know, think that they're special snowflakes, and so that they need to do something unique and fun and different and that sort of thing. And realistically, that's not the case, right? But of course, you have to handle a little bit with some gloves, right? And so at first, I actually wasn't sure what was happening and where the pushback was coming from. And what I was able to deduce after talking to back to the founders and CEOs was that they were no longer aligned with the compensation philosophy that they approved just a couple months prior.
Wow.
And instead of telling me that, which is very important. A career hack, in my opinion, is to work for founders and executive team who are assertive and who are not conflict averse and not passive aggressive. Because if they are conflict adverse, and conflict is even too strong of a word, I would say just difficult conversation adverse around like, hey, we previously signed off on this. We actually don't think it fits the needs of the business anymore. Can you please redesign this for me? Cool. That's a problem I can go solve.
Yeah.
But if you go and say to your executive team, Kelsey went and designed this and is pushing this onto the company, when one, that's not true, nor would that actually be appropriate for my role, right? Because compensation philosophy is so cross functional, then that actually doesn't give me the opportunity to fix the problem. So, what I ended up doing was, revamping the compensation philosophy because this was during the merit cycle. So it was too late to change,
Wow. Yeah.
right? So, again, had they come to me and expressed, their concerns sooner, would not have been as big of a deal. Also, it was, those founders, it was their first time going through anything like this at this scale. So I think there was also a piece of they didn't know what they didn't know, right? So they didn't
Mhm.
realize like, hey, I should just say like, well, to me it's common sense, right? But to them, they might be like, oh, we actually aren't aligned with this anymore. But like, how do we say this? Like, if we say it, what happens? Like, and like, I'm like, I didn't come up with the philosophy. Like, I'm not offended if you want to change it. Even if I had come up with it and you wanted to change it, I'm not going to be offended because ultimately we need to do what's best for the business and best for the employees, right? So if you come to
Yeah.
me with the strongest business case around, hey, we did approve this, but we need to change this because X, Y, and Z has changed. Okay, cool. Let's change it, right? And let me come back to you with some proposals and ideas, right? So it was basically negotiating around, okay, we have somebody who, has the ear of the CEO. CEO is not being honest about their place in approvals, to the point where we actually had to show that executive around like, yes, here are the screenshots of the CEO approving
Wow.
and writing.
That's wild.
Because he was actually getting very emotional and very angry about it. And sometimes, when executives, really enter into what I call their emotion mind versus their logic mind, I
Yeah.
will actually say to them, hey, I think you're getting a little too emotional for this conversation, and I'm happy to revisit it. But we both need to be at a calm, steady baseline. Would you like to reschedule this meeting? That usually snaps them out of it and gets them to like refocus around like, oh, maybe I am coming a little bit too hot, and like let's like try to problem solve versus just like, oh no, this isn't going to work or da, and versus like only shouting out problems to me,
Yeah.
especially if there's not data to support that these are actual problems. Like if they are just concerns.
Mhm.
And there's a difference between, in my opinion, having, concerns that are kind of nebulous floating out here, and then actually speaking from experience, what happens 5 steps ahead. So also being able to separate out those two, just
Yeah.
in general, I think is critical, like for any potential, I would say this falls for any business leader, right? But being able to separate out like, hey, this is what I think will happen versus, hey, I know this will happen 5 steps down if we do X, Y, and Z. And
Yeah.
so we were in the hypothetical land. There is no there, which is also usually based in fear. And so that's why to counteract that fear, we have to, pull people out of, anger, fear, and like go back to facts and ground back in facts. And so if somebody is in that really dysregulated headspace, I'm like, you can't have this conversation with me right now. Like, you're flooded. Your brain is literally flooded and like you can't think logically. Just
Yeah.
anyone can't think logically when they're in that headspace. So basically what we were able to do was get the CEO to, finally admit, that this was not the right compensation philosophy, even though it was recently approved. Work with that exec to say, hey, yep, like Kelsey is executing this. And like while she was aligned to it, she did not design it. I mean,
Yes.
it's not the final approver because I got put as the final approver according to the CEO, which is adorable because like we know in HR we are, we might be the final approver on, certain things. When it comes to something as that affects the business so deeply, like your compensation philosophy, you're not going to be the
Mm.
final approver. That's going to be your
Yeah.
C, maybe your board, right? Like there's or like if not the whole executive team, maybe a compensation committee within the executive team internally, right?
Totally.
So, so basically, once I was able to, convince them to like, hey, it's too late to really change what we have going on, but we're going to do, merit cycles twice per year because if we don't do them twice per year, we could potentially have people go 15 months without an increase, when we take into account eligibility roles, and rules and whatnot. And so I'm a big fan of doing comp review twice per year.
Yeah.
Way we can also eliminate more of the onesie twosies and be like, hey, you need to wait for the cycle, right? Unless it's
Yeah.
there's always going to be an exception, but when you have, comp review once per year, especially in startup world, you're going to have a lot more exceptions and you're actually going to create more work than if you just did 2 cycles, having done it both ways. And
Totally.
And so for the next cycle, what I was able to do was completely redesign the comp philosophy and bring in the data, right? And get everything, remake the ranges, like get and work with particularly each executive around like, hey, this is what we're thinking on how we're going to approach it. What do you think? And
Yeah.
so so my big learning from this, there's a few. But first is if you feel like there is something weird going on, there probably is. And it's probably due to, a business leader that you're working with being more difficult conversation averse. So that's a separate conversation around like how do we fix, you know, and like make business leaders be more comfortable with difficult conversations. I wouldn't even say conflict, right? Because a lot of the times it's debate.
Yeah.
But if somebody is naturally more passive or passive aggressive, debate can feel like conflict and can feel aggressive. So then they can get emotionally flooded and then you can't speak to them logically because they're living up in their emotions, their heart rate's going,
Mm.
they're flushed, like it's not a good place to be. And then I think also like feeling empowered to actually call out what's happening or like, hey, I don't think that like you're in the right headspace to have this conversation with me. I'm sensing that like we're talking a lot about emotions and hypotheticals versus reality and what's happening and what's been approved. So when you're ready, I'm happy to revisit this conversation. And naming that because a lot of people will just, sit there and they'll turn it into a fight. Like
Yeah.
I've at a separate company, I actually broke up a fight between a executive level consultant and one of our chief executives just by saying because they were going at each other over they both had a particular opposite view of how to solve a problem. And I was like, hey, you guys are taught, you guys are, clearly on the opposite side. What is your desired business outcome? You go
Yeah.
first. You go second. How do we get to that? That's what we're focused on. So I think, being that calm person in the room
Yeah.
and also being able to call out around like, you guys are getting too heated. In a lot of startup cases, we're building really cool things necessarily saving lives, right? And
Yeah.
so, as somebody who early in my career worked in healthcare, but on the G&A side, it's that's a different thing where it's like, okay, for example, if I don't pay these people properly, we might not be able to save lives, right? But
Yeah.
like we were talking about, SaaS startups, that's not necessarily the case, right? And so, so really like grounding back down into you can absolutely be intense and passionate about your work, and you can make strong business cases and not live in emotional mind, right? And
Totally.
really, the ideal place to be, I'd say somewhere, in the middle between being completely hyper logical and emotional, but like really that center and being able to bring that human side with, the facts and the logic and the data, because the combination tends to be the most effective. Of
Totally.
course, exceptions where, there are some business leaders who want like just the facts and the data, and there's some business leaders who are going to want the emotional appeal.
Mm.
Well, maybe you have to go in order where you give, the facts and data first. That doesn't work. So you have to go to emotional appeal. I've had to do
Yeah.
that before. And, so also, getting to know your business leaders and what works best for their understanding style, especially if it's something that maybe think about every day, right?
Yeah.
Or something that's brand new to them.
Yeah, there's so much rich learnings in there, and I think we could spend probably another two podcasts digging into the different things that you shared there. I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more about how did this impact the employees? Because it sounds like you're able to protect the employees from seeing all of this from happening, and actually the comp cycle did go ahead, and you were able to change things. So were they fully kind of unaware of what was happening, or did it trickle down to them in some format?
Yeah, they had no idea. Like
Yeah.
unless like I or one of the executives told them, like they had no idea. One
Yeah.
of the reasons why I've stayed in HR has actually been being able to be an advocate for people. Like naturally, that's always been something that I've gravitated towards. I think in that three-legged stool of people, processes, and data, I put that under people around like, hey, how do we make this like as positive as an experience as possible? So at companies, when I work with them, I build out similar to a customer journey, I build out an employee journey. And
Awesome.
so we talk about, what does onboarding look like? What does pre-hire look like? What are those moments that matter within the employee life cycle? Things like, the compensation review, being promoted, taking lead, getting a new manager, all the different types of, being involved in a employee relations case, and it's basically a chart of output over time.
Yeah.
And, and thinking about like, okay, yep. So for example, if somebody is involved in an employee relations case, their
Mm.
output is probably going to go down because they're going to be really stressed about it.
Yeah.
Especially, if it's a startup. In my experience, the last 11 years, in like Series B startups to post IPO and including some subsidiaries of large companies.
Hmm.
There's a lot of individuals who I would say are higher in neuroticism, and that's not a negative thing. It just means that you need to give them information, and they do very well with information, and they do very well with work. Don't give them information. If you don't give them things to do, they're going to start to crash out.
Yeah, totally. Totally. It's interesting you mentioned the employee lens, because I think
it's a really difficult position because you kind of have to take into account what does the decisions that you make or the projects that you're working on where, to your point, actually the decisions may not even lie with you, even though the responsibility falls on HR. But there's a balance between you're there to help grow the business, but then also making sure that you get the best out of employees and then also make sure the employee experience is good. And that's a really, really tough balance to hit. And actually sounds like you were able to hit that really, really well because employees had no idea what was going on in the background. And the second time round, they were able to, again, get a great experience, but you were also able to align what the leadership needed to do and how they got there. So I guess how would you have done it differently? If blank slate, what would have needed to happen to make sure that this didn't happen in the first place?
Yeah, totally. In hindsight, I would have scripted the founder CEO more
Mm,
and actually
okay.
work with him more directly on like, hey, this is what I need you to say to the executive team, versus me saying those things, around like, hey, we're one company. You may not agree with a particular individual decision, but ultimately this is what, the CEO has decided on. So like we are one united front. Like that messaging should have over and over again come from him.
Yeah.
And so that also goes back to, also before I started the process, while I thought I had all the approvals, I should have gone back in and double checked that he was still aligned with everything.
Mm,
Because if so, then I could have, redesigned everything. It would have been a scramble. It would have been fast, and I probably would have had to, backdate raises, but being able to then communicate to the employee base around like, hey, yep, we're working through, some changes with the new team.
mm.
We're still going through the process. It's just, on your, for example, May 1st paycheck, you're going to find that your raise, if you receive one, is backdated, March 1st, right? And so you might have to
Yeah.
do, 2 months of retro pay instead of, say, half a month or 1 month. But when you communicate with people and they know, that's the biggest thing because a lot of leaders will try to push things through quickly instead of just communicating around like
Yeah.
we're going to do retro pay, which is super normal. It's not ideal, but it's very very normal. I don't think I've worked at a single company that has not retro.
Yeah. I think your point around like wanting to move it quickly and potentially prematurely, we see that even more in the age of AI, right? Like people are wanting to progress really quickly and they make potentially sometimes rash decisions. And it's really interesting that you shared this story and thank you for doing that because it doesn't feel like AI could have helped in any way or any other tooling. Like this is such a human thing to fix. How do you think, I'm going to ask you a bit of a tough question, but how do you think you might have used AI, if at all, in this scenario? Like, would you have created like a version of yourself that your CEO could have checked with? Would you have used it as a translation mechanism or maybe use it to create scripts? I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on, or is this something where you're like, hey, this is not a place, this is an age old problem. This is not a place for AI. We would just solve it through conversation and through leveling up our leaders. Like, where do you kind of sit on that front? Because also
Yeah.
before we started recording, we were talking about how AI forwards you are and how automation forwards you are. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this particular piece.
Totally. So I think like in this particular case, I like to frame issues as, is this a people problem or is this a
Okay.
process problem? And so right now with the maturity of AI, it can solve a lot of process problems, which is awesome because oftentimes you're spending your time solving process problems, right? So if you can automate that and you have more time to spend on solving the people problems. And so but some, and this was, years ago even before GPT was released. So, but like let's say it was today and let's say that, I did those things differently. I could have built out and done the analysis a lot more quickly, right?
Oh,
And
interesting.
So like on the compensation side. And
Yes.
so that's one way where actually I wouldn't have, making a change wouldn't have slowed down the business as much, or potentially at all, right? Depending on how it's built out. But like when we go back to the idea of like, is it a process problem or is it a people problem? This was a people problem, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to be able to, use AI in creative ways. I think
Mhm.
you also have to like do the change management that goes around with any change. And so often easier to start making changes with processes
Mm.
versus anything related to emotion, difficult conversations, that sort of thing. You can build up to that over time, right? Like when you prove that like whatever tool that you're using
Mm.
works and like, hey, this is how this works and this is how we're doing this going forward. But without that proof of concept on something that's lower stakes, if you try to throw it into something that's higher stakes right away, and if it fails, then essentially you've just failed, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it'll be very, very interesting to see over, I think, the next 5 years or so, like where the bridge is crossed from solving process problems to
Yeah.
potentially solving people problems.
I'm very curious to, yeah, see that myself too, because there was a lot of like manager AI coaching things that are cropping up, and I know that even founders in that space are facing the issue of, well, hey, maybe we could build this in Claude. And it's interesting you say that because you mentioned the timeline of 5 years, and we're starting to try and solve these pieces. But I really like the framework that you said, which was, is it a people thing or is it process thing? If it's a process thing, then it's probably low hanging fruit and therefore lower risk, and therefore let's solve for those things first. Which I guess is it leads me to kind of the final question before we start to wrap up. Do you have any other kind of advice or frameworks or thoughts you want to leave someone with who's in the middle of solving some of the processes or people issues in this world of AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like one, like AI is your friend right now.
Mm.
And I think that I've seen some resistance to using AI, and that resistance belonged 10 years ago. It's too late. It's here. I don't think we are quite at the inflection of the hockey stick just yet, but we're getting there, right? And so I think anyone who is hesitant to learn how to use AI, and there, look, we can argue the ethics and all of that fun type of stuff. I'm out in Phoenix, Arizona. We have a water crisis. I get it. There's pieces there. However, yeah, that ship sailed. If you had a problem with it when it was called machine learning, that ship sailed over 10 years ago. It's too so come on in. The water's fine. Learn how to, really have an efficiency based mindset. My goal when I come into organization high level is effectiveness and efficiency. And that was even, before, we were using AI within corporations directly, right? We might have been using machine learning within engineering, or in my case, jerry rigging certain systems to do what I wanted them to do when, people were copying and pasting stuff from Word into emails and all this crazy stuff that, we wouldn't do today, hopefully.
Yeah.
But, like, that type of stuff you can absolutely automate. And when I build out, people team mission statements, it's usually some version of automate all that we can within the employee life cycle so that we can spend time on the moments that matter, because that's the human side that can't be automated yet. And the moments that matter are going to vary by company, right? So that might be going on some sort of leave, that which there are great vendors for, right?
Mhm.
If somebody doesn't have that knowledge in-house, and if you're distributed remote, it's almost impossible to have all that knowledge in-house. Hey, I ran this engagement survey and I don't like the way that it is displaying the data, or I want this particular cut of data, then great. Like use your Claude Enterprise license to analyze that and have it
Yes.
displayed differently and prompted differently to give you that analysis. Whereas before maybe you had either a vendor and like a people scientist at that vendor doing that analysis for you, or you're doing that analysis manually.
Mm,
And so you can, while you need to, of course, double check the work and make sure that you are able to tell the story, and that's where the human side comes in, or have AI build the story for you, and you make sure that you're double checking it, you're aligned with the story. You can point out any, and like I think one of the awesome things too that you can do is actually prompt, say Claude, and say, hey, here, here's the story that we're aligned on in telling the situation to business leaders. Give me 5 points of pushback as if you were a VP of engineering or a VP of product, right? And that way you can actually prepare yourself. So that's what I mean, like AI is your friend at this stage, and the
yeah.
more that you can use it to really like outsource and be your second brain and like
Mm,
really strategize with it, the better, right? And I think on the last piece, while in my opinion, AI isn't ready to solve, I would say, complex psychological people problems, such as, a conflict adverse CEO. That's not something AI at this stage is going to solve. And maybe in the future, there can be some wonderful coaching that's done, but that person still has to take in the coaching. And how are they measured on the coaching? And, if they don't become more assertive, what happens to their role? Does anything actually happen? If something happens, then there's no
right.
accountability. What's the point, right? And so I think, deeply leaning into for probably the next 2-ish years
Mm,
before the hockey stick takes off, which, estimate 2 to 3 years, really leaning into the human side. And
mm,
so, a lot of HR professionals like to either live within the more operational analytical side or the more people problem solving side, more the HR business partner side, that sort of thing. I think there's going to be a consolidation where you need to be able to do both. And
interesting.
so learning how to do both. So even if you're an HR business partner, how do you automate your reporting, right?
Mm,
Have maybe monthly reviews or your QBRs with your business leaders. How do you present data? How do you become, data driven, and learning that skill versus only it being conversational, right? And
yeah.
so I think that consolidation will be because everything, for the last 15, 16 years or so, started to separate out and be more specialized. I think you're actually going to see HR become full of generalists again and who can put things together.
Yeah, a generalist who is a superstar at AI and being able to basically 10x themselves. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that in engineering already, and it's interesting that we got 24 months for this to happen in HR. Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us on this. Love the outtakes here. And where can people find you? Is that LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn at Kelsey Browning. Pretty simple. I should be the only HR
Awesome.
one there, but
Sounds
happy
good.
to connect on LinkedIn for anybody who's interested in, in chatting through these types of problems.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody, for listening in, and we'll catch you on the next one.